Most people believe peace will come later, when the past stops hurting and the future finally behaves. Yet what if the mind doesn't calm down by fixing time, but by stepping out of its grip altogether? There's a quiet moment each day, easy to miss, where nothing is demanding, nothing is chasing you, nothing is being replayed. It often arrives while you're washing a cup, waiting at a red light, or sitting at the edge of your bed before the day begins. And strangely, that overlooked moment may hold the relief you've been searching for in all the wrong places. This story is for anyone who feels tired of carrying conversations that already ended and fears that haven't even begun. For those who smile on the outside while inside the mind keeps running long after the body is still. You won't find loud motivation here, only a gentle return to something steady and human. Because peace isn't a distant destination. It's more like a doorway that appears when you stop rushing past it. And once you notice it, you may realize it had been quietly waiting for you all along. There was once a person who discovered that trust doesn't start with believing everything will be fine. It begins with trusting this single breath, this single moment, exactly as it is. What happened to him wasn't dramatic, yet it changed the texture of his entire life. If you listen closely, you might recognize parts of your own story unfolding inside his. And somewhere along the way, without pressure or effort, you may feel something in you begin to soften. He often felt pulled apart by two invisible tides, one dragging him backward into old regrets, the other tugging him toward disasters that hadn't happened. Mornings arrived before he was ready, as if the day had started without asking his permission. While brushing his teeth, he would replay a careless comment from years ago, wincing as though it had just been spoken. Then, almost in the same breath, he'd imagine tomorrow collapsing in ways he couldn't quite name. It was exhausting, this constant time travel without ever leaving the bathroom sink. Somewhere inside, he wondered if everyone else was secretly as tired as he was. On the bus, he watched people staring out the window with that same faraway look, and he had a hunch they weren't seeing the streets at all. His mind drifted too, snagging on memories of criticism that still stung like paper cuts. A stranger's rude tone from last week replayed louder than the rumble of the engine. He tried to focus on the passing trees, but his thoughts kept slipping their leash. It was like trying to hold water in his hands. The tighter he squeezed, the faster it escaped. By afternoon, he carried a peculiar heaviness, as if he were hauling around bags packed with moments that no longer existed. Conversations felt slightly out of sync, because part of him was always elsewhere, rehearsing or rewinding. When a colleague laughed nearby, he startled, realizing he hadn't heard a word they'd said. He nodded anyway, hoping it passed for normal. Inside, though, there was a quiet ache, the kind that comes from being absent from your own life. He couldn't remember the last time a single hour had felt whole. That evening, he sat on a park bench and noticed how even the sunset couldn't hold him for long. Colors bloomed across the sky, soft and forgiving, yet his mind kept sketching unfinished tomorrows over them. He sighed, not dramatically, just a small surrender that barely moved his shoulders. A child nearby chased a pigeon with complete devotion to the moment, and he felt a flicker of envy. How did it look so effortless, that simple being there? He suspected he'd forgotten something obvious, like misplacing keys already in his pocket. As the air cooled, a quiet question surfaced, gentle but persistent. What if peace had been waiting in the moments he kept stepping over? He didn't answer right away, almost afraid to disturb the thought. The bench felt solid beneath him, the ground steady, as if inviting him to stay put for once. For a few seconds, he simply listened to the leaves rustling, unsure why that felt unfamiliar. Something about the stillness hinted at a doorway he'd never noticed. And without realizing it, he leaned slightly toward it, as though the present itself had just whispered his name. In the days that followed, he kept returning to that bench, almost absent-mindedly, as if something there had unfinished business with him. At first, he still brought his usual companions, the rehearsed arguments, the imagined catastrophes, the old embarrassments that popped in uninvited. Yet the longer he sat, the more those thoughts seemed to lose their sharp edges, like waves smoothing stones. He noticed that when he stopped trying to solve yesterday and tomorrow at the same time, his shoulders dropped a little. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet loosening, the way a tight knot begins to give. For the first time, he wondered if his mind had been negotiating with time instead of living in it. One afternoon, he watched a woman feed crumbs to birds with unhurried patience, as though nothing else existed. She didn't glance at a clock or rush the moment along. And oddly enough, nothing seemed to collapse because of it. The world kept turning. Buses kept arriving. Clouds drifted without needing her supervision. He felt a subtle surprise, almost childlike, at the realization that life didn't demand his constant anticipation. Maybe the present wasn't a narrow ledge between disasters after all. Maybe it was more like a quiet room that had been open the whole time. He began to notice small supports hidden inside ordinary minutes. The steadiness of his breath, the dependable weight of his footsteps, the way sunlight warmed his sleeve without asking for anything back. These details had always been there, patiently holding their ground while his attention wandered off. When he allowed himself to rest in them, even briefly, a gentle calm seeped in. It felt less like achieving peace and more like remembering where it had been left. The emptiness he feared in the present turned out to be a kind of quiet generosity. One evening, as he walked home, he caught himself smiling at nothing in particular, which startled him more than any worry ever had. The streetlights hummed softly, and he realized he wasn't bracing for the next problem. For a few blocks, he simply walked, noticing the rhythm of his steps like a metronome guiding him back to now. There was a strange trust growing, fragile but sincere, as if each moment could hold him without needing guarantees. He didn't fully understand it, and maybe that was the point. Some things, he sensed, only made sense when experienced one breath at a time. Still, a part of him hesitated, wary of letting go of the vigilance that had once felt like control. If he stopped scanning the horizon for danger, who would keep everything from falling apart? The question lingered as he reached his door, keys cool in his palm, heartbeat steady in a way he barely recognized. He paused there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet hum of the evening. Something inside him was learning to trust this single slice of time, though it didn't yet know how. And just beyond that uncertainty, another memory stirred. The reason he had started guarding himself so tightly in the first place. Long before the bench and the slow evenings, he had lived as if bracing for impact. Mistakes trailed him like stubborn shadows, especially the ones that had cost him someone's trust. A few careless choices, a harsh reply spoken in fatigue, a door that closed more quietly than he expected. These memories replayed with cruel precision. He told himself that revisiting them might prevent new damage, though it mostly reopened old wounds. Even laughter felt risky, as if joy might distract him from staying prepared. His attention rarely stayed where his body was, which made ordinary moments feel oddly hollow. During conversations, he'd nod while silently calculating what could go wrong next. When friends shared good news, he felt relief for them but also a flicker of dread, waiting for the hidden catch. It wasn't that he wanted disaster, he just didn't trust calm to last. Life, in his experience, had a habit of surprising him at the worst possible time. Sleep offered little escape, because night invited the mind to wander freely through unfinished stories. He'd stare at the ceiling, replaying scenes he wished he could edit, imagining better lines he might have said. Other times he rehearsed future conversations that hadn't happened, preparing for criticism that might never come. His body lay still, but inside, it was like running endless drills for emergencies. By morning, he felt as though he had traveled miles without leaving the bed. He feared that if he stopped anticipating danger, he would lose the fragile sense of control he'd built. Worry had become a strange kind of armor, heavy, uncomfortable, but familiar enough to trust. When someone spoke sharply to him at work, his chest tightened not just from the moment itself, but from all the echoes it awakened. He carried those echoes quietly, unsure how to set them down. Letting his guard drop felt less like rest and more like standing unprotected in a storm. Yet beneath the vigilance, there was a softer truth he barely admitted to himself. He was tired of living everywhere except where his feet touched the ground. Sometimes, while washing dishes or tying his shoes, he'd feel a brief stillness slip in before his mind chased it away. Those fleeting pauses felt almost forbidden, like glimpsing a peaceful country he didn't have permission to enter. He sensed there was a different way to live, though he couldn't picture it clearly. And somewhere in that blur of memory and anticipation, a small, persistent longing began to take shape. Not long after, he found himself lingering in a small antique shop he didn't remember deciding to enter. The air smelled faintly of wood and time, and the shelves were crowded with objects that seemed to hum with forgotten stories. Among them sat a delicate hourglass, its glass slightly clouded, its sand pale and slow. Without thinking, he picked it up, turning it over just to watch the grains begin their quiet descent. Something about its motion made his chest tighten, though he couldn't say why. He bought it for a few coins and carried it home like a fragile secret. On his table, the hourglass became both companion and tormentor, always measuring, always moving. Whenever the sand ran out, he flipped it again, almost urgently, as if stillness might invite something unbearable. Even during meals, his eyes drifted toward it, tracking the steady fall of seconds he felt responsible for managing. It was oddly comforting to keep time in motion, even if it never truly eased him. Soon he noticed how the hourglass refused to let the room feel quiet. Its silent falling mirrored the restless current inside him, a reminder that something was always slipping away. If he tried to sit without touching it, unease crept in, like an itch he couldn't scratch. So he kept turning it again and again, convincing himself that staying ahead of time meant staying safe. Deep down, though, he suspected he was only feeding the very tension he wanted to escape. Visitors sometimes glanced at it curiously, but he brushed off their questions with a faint smile. How could he explain that the object felt less like decoration and more like a lifeline? When criticism or disappointment stung, he'd reach for it instinctively, flipping it as if resetting the moment itself. The gesture gave him something to do with his hands while his thoughts scrambled for footing. Still, the relief never lasted longer than a single cycle of sand. One evening, as dusk softened the edges of the room, he caught his reflection in the glass while turning it yet again. For a brief second, he saw not control but fatigue, a man trying to outrun something that couldn't be outrun. The hourglass kept flowing, indifferent to his effort, patient in a way that unsettled him. He placed it down, but didn't step away, as though waiting for it to reveal a secret it had been holding back. And in the quiet that followed, a presence at the doorway made him realize he was no longer alone. The figure at the doorway didn't announce himself, just stood there with a calm that felt almost out of place in the restless room. He was older, though not in a frail way, more like someone who had stopped hurrying years ago and never resumed. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the hourglass, the table, the man's tense shoulders, as if there were no rush to understand. When he finally stepped inside, his footsteps were so unhurried that they seemed to quiet the air. It was the first time the room had felt spacious in a long while. He approached the table and watched the sand falling, not with concern but with a faint, knowing softness. The man felt an odd impulse to explain himself, though no accusation had been made. Before he could speak, the visitor gently placed 2 fingers on the hourglass, steadying it without flipping it. The motion was so simple it almost went unnoticed, yet the sudden stillness felt louder than any ticking clock. For a moment, both of them just stood there, listening to the silence settle. Life only unfolds where your feet are. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment, the older man said quietly, as if sharing something obvious that most people overlook. His voice carried no urgency, no hint of instruction, just a calm certainty. The man glanced down at his own shoes, noticing the pressure of the floor beneath them for the first time that day. It was such a small sensation, yet it anchored him in a way that surprised him. He hadn't realized how rarely he actually felt where he was standing. The visitor moved toward the window and paused, observing the evening light with the same patience he had given the hourglass. He seemed entirely at ease, doing nothing in particular, which struck the man as both comforting and unsettling. How could someone stand so still without reaching for distraction or control? The question hovered unspoken, but the mentor's quiet presence made it feel safe to wonder. It was as if time itself had slowed out of respect for him. When the older man finally turned back, his gaze held a gentle invitation rather than an answer. He didn't pick up the hourglass again, leaving it upright, untouched, as though demonstrating a different way to exist with it. The room felt unfamiliar now, softer around the edges, like a place waiting to be rediscovered. The man sensed that something important was about to be revealed, though he couldn't predict what shape it would take. And for once, he didn't reach to flip the glass. He simply waited. The older man pulled a chair closer and sat, not as a guest, but as someone settling into a moment that already belonged to him. He rested his hands loosely on his knees and closed his eyes for a breath, as if listening to something quieter than sound. The man across from him shifted, unsure what was expected, then noticed the faint rise and fall of the mentor's chest. It was slow, unforced, like waves that had no intention of hurrying to shore. Without meaning to, he matched it, one careful inhale at a time. "The mind rests only here," the mentor said softly, tapping the table once, not the hourglass. The gesture felt almost playful, as though pointing to a hidden door in plain sight. He invited the man to notice three simple things: the texture of the chair beneath his palms, the distant murmur of a passing car, the cool air brushing his cheek. These details appeared ordinary, yet they anchored him more firmly than any plan ever had. For a fleeting instant, the noise in his head thinned, like fog parting to reveal ground beneath. He tried to hold on to that clarity, but impatience crept in, whispering that something more dramatic should happen. The mentor seemed to sense it and smiled gently, the kind of smile that forgives before being asked. "You don't have to chase this," he murmured, almost amused. "Just return when you wander, the way you'd guide a tired child back home." The man exhaled, surprised by the tenderness in that image, and felt his shoulders soften without permission. They sat in companionable quiet, the hourglass untouched between them, its sand continuing its steady descent. This time the movement didn't feel like an enemy slipping away, but like a background rhythm that required nothing from him. He noticed the faint scent of tea on the mentor's sleeve, the warmth of the lamp pooling on the table, the surprising steadiness of his own heartbeat. Each sensation arrived without effort, as though the present had been patiently waiting for his attention. He realized he wasn't holding the moment together. It was holding him. A fragile trust began to form, not in the future behaving well, but in this single slice of time being enough. The mentor rose slowly, leaving the chair slightly warm, and moved toward the door without ceremony. Before stepping out, he paused just long enough to meet the man's eyes, a quiet assurance passing between them. No grand lesson, no final instruction, just the sense that the secret had already been placed in his hands. And as the door clicked softly behind him, the man turned toward the hourglass with a new, uncertain curiosity. The next morning he woke with the familiar urge to reach for the hourglass, then hesitated, hand hovering mid-air. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and noticed the quiet weight of the blanket pooled around his feet. The room was ordinary, pale light, faint street noise, the soft creak of the building settling, yet it felt unexpectedly steady. His thoughts still tried to sprint ahead, listing worries like items on a grocery receipt, but he gently nudged them aside. Just for a moment, he stayed with the simple fact of being there. During breakfast, impatience returned, tapping its foot inside his chest. He caught himself replaying an awkward conversation from years ago, and almost laughed, a soft, surprised sound. The toast was warm in his hands, the butter melting in uneven rivers, and somehow that small detail anchored him again. He took one slow breath, the kind the mentor had modeled without making a fuss about it. Relief slipped in quietly, like a guest who doesn't want to be noticed. At work, tension usually stalked him through every task, whispering that he was one mistake away from disappointment. That day, when a colleague spoke sharply, the old reaction flared, heat in his face, words lining up defensively. Then he felt the edge of the desk beneath his fingertips, solid and present, and paused just long enough for the surge to soften. He answered more calmly than he thought possible, surprising both of them. It wasn't perfection, just a small detour from the usual spiral. Evenings became gentler, though not without setbacks. Some nights he still flipped the hourglass compulsively, watching the sand fall as if trying to outrun something unnamed. Other nights he left it untouched, sitting nearby with a cup of tea growing lukewarm in his hands. In those quieter stretches, a faint gratitude appeared. Not fireworks, just a steady glow that didn't demand explanation. He began to sense that peace wasn't a finish line, but a practice of returning. One twilight, he realized he had spent nearly an hour watching the sky deepen without once checking the hourglass. The discovery startled him, then warmed him, like finding money in an old coat pocket. He wasn't cured of worry, not by a long shot, but the tension no longer felt like the only language he spoke. Somewhere along the way, clarity had started replacing the constant noise, one unremarkable moment at a time, and as the first stars appeared, He felt a quiet readiness for whatever the next test of this fragile calm might be. The test arrived sooner than he expected, disguised as an ordinary message that made his stomach drop. A few sharp words from someone whose opinion still mattered, hinting at disappointment he thought he had outgrown. His mind instantly tried to sprint ahead, sketching worst-case endings with exhausting creativity. For a moment, the old urge to grab the hourglass pulsed through him like muscle memory. Instead, he placed his palm flat on the table and felt its cool steadiness, as if borrowing strength from something that didn't overthink. He read the message again, slower this time, noticing what was actually there rather than what fear kept adding. The room hummed softly, a refrigerator cycling on, distant footsteps in the hallway, ordinary sounds that kept him anchored. His breath came uneven at first, then gradually settled like dust drifting back to the ground. He realized he didn't have to solve the entire future of the relationship right now. All that existed was this single moment and the next kind word he could choose. When he replied, his fingers paused over the keys, guided less by panic and more by a quiet sincerity. He acknowledged the hurt, without defending himself, which felt oddly vulnerable and strong at the same time. The conversation didn't magically transform, but it softened at the edges, as though both sides had stepped back from a cliff. For once, he didn't replay the exchange obsessively afterward. He simply noticed the surprising lightness in his chest, like a window cracked open after a long winter. Later, walking home, he passed a group of teenagers laughing loudly, their joy spilling onto the sidewalk without restraint. Normally, he might have bristled at the noise, already tired from the day's tension. Instead, he found himself smiling faintly, not because everything was perfect, but because he was actually there to witness it. His steps felt grounded, each one landing with quiet certainty. The city moved around him, and for once, he wasn't trying to outrun it. When he reached his door, the hourglass waited on the table, unchanged, patient as ever. He approached it with a calmer curiosity, noticing how the remaining sand caught the lamplight. There was no urgency to flip it, no need to measure what couldn't be controlled anyway. He rested his hand beside it, feeling the faint vibration of his own pulse against the wood. Something told him that this small moment, unremarkable, steady, real, was quietly reshaping the way he would meet whatever came next. That night, he remembered the mentor's quiet invitation and decided to try something that felt almost too simple to matter. He sat beside the hourglass without touching it, letting his hands rest loosely in his lap. The room seemed to lean in, curious about this unfamiliar stillness. He looked around slowly, naming in his mind 5 things he could see: the curve of the lamp, the faint scratch on the table, the soft shadow behind the chair. Each detail felt like a small anchor dropping into calm water. Next, he listened, really listened, as if the world had been speaking softly all along. A car passed in the distance, tires whispering against pavement, followed by the subtle ticking of the cooling stove. Even his own breathing had a sound, gentle and steady, like someone walking barefoot across a quiet floor. He hadn't realized how much noise lived inside silence. The more he noticed, the less space worry seemed to have. He lifted one hand and pressed it lightly against his chest, feeling the rhythm there, dependable and unhurried. One slow breath in, one slow breath out. Nothing forced, nothing dramatic. His shoulders eased, almost surprised by the permission to soften. The hourglass stood nearby, no longer demanding to be flipped, just part of the scene like everything else. For the first time, he sensed that the present moment wasn't something to perform correctly, but something to inhabit gently. A memory tried to intrude, an old embarrassment that usually tightened his throat, but he treated it like a cloud drifting across the sky. He noticed it, then returned to the feeling of the chair supporting him, the floor steady beneath his feet. The shift was subtle yet profound, like choosing to sit by a window instead of pacing a hallway. He wondered how many storms had passed while he'd been busy predicting them. The thought made him smile, a quiet, forgiving kind of smile. When he opened his eyes fully, the room looked the same, but felt different, as though he had finally arrived after a long, unnecessary detour. He didn't rush to capture the feeling, trusting it to linger or fade on its own terms. The simplicity of the exercise surprised him most. 5 things, 1 breath, a moment reclaimed. It felt like a tool he could carry anywhere, invisible yet steady. And as he glanced toward the hourglass, he sensed it might soon hold a new meaning altogether. Morning arrived quietly, spilling pale light across the table where the hourglass stood waiting. He approached it without the old urgency, noticing how calm had begun to feel less like a stranger. The sand inside had settled into a small, patient hill, unmoving and complete in its own way. For once, he didn't see time as something slipping through his fingers. It looked more like a refuge he could step into whenever he remembered how. He carried the hourglass to the window and set it down where the sunlight could pass through it. Tiny grains shimmered, suspended between what had fallen and what remained, neither rushed nor delayed. Watching it, he understood something that couldn't quite be explained in words. The present wasn't a narrow gap between regrets and fears. It was the only place life actually touched him. Everything else was just weather passing through the mind. Later, when an old wave of worry rose without warning, he didn't push it away or follow it down its usual path. He placed a hand on the table, felt the solid surface, and let the sensation ground him like a quiet promise. The feeling ebbed on its own, as all things eventually do when they're not held too tightly. Peace, he realized, wasn't built in grand gestures, but in these small, steady returns. One mindful moment at a time, like placing stones to form a path. As days passed, the hourglass remained mostly untouched, no longer a device to control time, but a gentle reminder of where to rest. Sometimes he would sit beside it with a cup of tea, not seeking insight, just sharing the silence. There was a softness in his life now, a willingness to meet each moment without rehearsing the next. Even loneliness felt different, less like an emptiness and more like space waiting to be filled with presence. He had stopped chasing life long enough to notice it walking beside him. One evening, as the sky faded into deep blue, he left the hourglass by the open window and stepped outside with nothing in his hands. The air was cool, steady, real against his skin, and he felt rooted in a way that needed no explanation. Somewhere behind him, the sand continued its quiet descent, faithful and unhurried. Ahead of him, the path stretched into the unknown, no longer a threat, but an invitation. And for the first time, his life felt as though it was finally being lived where it had always been waiting. Now,